We're back. We're back to talk about our first major class of denominator errors, which is not using one. So sometimes people just ignore denominators. They include the numerator, the count of something, but don't tell us the size of the group of potential things that led to the things. So for example, what if I told you there were 34 cases of COVID-19 last week? Well, is that bad? Well, it totally depends on the denominator, right? That's what provides context. Is our denominator the whole nation of New Zealand? Hey, that's not bad. Or is our denominator the White House? That's really bad. Okay, so how you interpret your numerator completely depends on your denominator. Don't just forget it or ignore it. Here's another example. How do we analyze the biggest stock market drops in the Dow Jones Industrial Average in the United States? Well, one way we could do it is just ask what were the biggest stock market drops in history in terms of raw numbers. Well, if you look down this list, there's a whole bunch: 2008, 2008, 2001, 2008, 2008, 2016, 2015. All seem pretty recent. Wonder why that is. Haven't there been stock market crashes in the past, like right before the Great Depression, maybe in the late 1920s, and then also in the 1980s? Well, the problem is that we're ignoring our denominator here. We're ignoring the fact that the Dow Jones Industrial Average has spiked over time. It's gotten much, 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 much bigger in recent years. So just saying there's a drop of, say, 733 points, like on October 15th, 2008, what does that mean? 733 points out of what? 733 points if the Dow Jones was 800 the day before is a pretty big deal. Maybe it's slightly less of a deal if it was 25,000, right? The denominator really matters. Fun fact, this bit of the Great Recession right here in 2008, 2009, that's when I graduated college. But I turned out okay. So hopefully many of you, despite the economic difficulties right now, will fare the same. That's my hope anyway, and maybe my inspirational story. Though I certainly got a little bit lucky, no question there. In fact, recognizing the role of luck in your life, just to insert a little life lesson into this video, I think is something that everybody could stand to do a little bit more of. All right, so a better way to look at the biggest stock market drops in history would be maybe not to just ask about the biggest, but to ask about the most severe, percentage-wise, right? So we're accounting for the denominator that is the size of the Dow Jones Industrial Average at the time that we're looking at the drop. Now we see bigger issues in, say, 1987 and 1929, these times that we would have expected to see huge stock market drops because we know they were right around the time of depressions or recessions. And this drop from October 15th, 2008, that was the second largest in terms of raw numbers of all time, is actually only ninth in percentage, and nowhere near the top drop, which was over 22% in October of 1987. The drop on October 15th, 2008 was just under 8%. Here's another example. Don't actually steal cars. That's not what I'm meaning to imply here. But as our friend at Zodiac MF asks here, what's the connection in this headline? He's asking it sarcastically. The most stolen car in the US is also the best selling. Seems like maybe they're forgetting to account for the denominator here when writing this headline. What do you think I mean by that? What is the connection? So what I want you to do here is I want you to pause the video. Actually pause the video. I've put a comment beneath it. I would like you all to take just a minute to respond written to this slide. What is the connection between a car being the best selling and the most stolen? Okay, just put a little line. Don't read anybody else's comments, just put your own, okay? And I want to see what folks say. All right, so actually pause the video and just take a minute to reply to my comment below the video. Thank you. Moving on now, maps. You will see maps that neglect denominators all the time. And this is one of my favorite XKCDs. His pet peeve number 208, geographic profile maps, which are basically just population maps. So if you look at your website's users or maybe your company's buyers, and you just create a heat map that doesn't account for the denominator of population, you're going to see these hot areas just around population centers. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that you're especially popular in that area. To know that, you would need to do per capita measures that use the population as a denominator. Okay, otherwise you'll just see population heat maps get hot around a lot of people for everything, from a website's users to subscribers to Martha Stewart Living to consumers of furry porn. The conclusion should not be to make your business based on furry porn. Okay, so always account for population denominators when you make or consume a map. Now, here's an interesting question that Ellenberg brings up in his book, How Not to Be Wrong. Do you always want a denominator? So there are some situations, I think, where focusing too much on the denominator and adjusting for the denominator can feel a little ethically weird. For example, Ellenberg brings up the example of saying 1,074 Israelis were killed by Palestinians from 2000 to 2005, and that proportionally, that is 0.015% of the Israeli population. So in the US, that would be like losing 50,000 people. In China, like losing 223,000. But in Slovenia, only like losing 300. And in Tuvalu, only like losing 1 to 2 people. Tuvalu is a small island nation in the Pacific. Are these equally bad things? Does it make sense to compare these and say one is like the other? It feels a little weird when you start talking about like 1,000 Israelis is worth 50,000 Americans. You don't want to get to the point where you're acting like one human life is worth more than another. I really don't like that idea. So let's think about it another way. 1,074 people killed in each of these countries. That's 0.015% in Israel, but a much smaller fraction of the US or China, but would be over 10% of the population of Tuvalu. So again, are these equally bad things? Now we're looking at the same number of people killed, but also it would obviously be differently devastating for each of these societies and countries at large. You'd still have 1,000 families suffering, so that's important to consider. But I think it is also important to consider perhaps the effect on the broader society. So there's no good answer here. All I'm saying is just be cognizant of if it feels ethically weird to be using a denominator. Don't say, for example, as a proportion of population, the 1994 genocide in Rwanda was 9 times as bad as the Holocaust. That's not a good way to put things, even if it's mathematically accurate. The genocide in Rwanda killed 800,000 people, and the Holocaust killed about 11 million. Human lives are human lives, and we don't want to discount some just because they came from a bigger denominator. That doesn't make sense. But it also doesn't make sense to discount them because they come from a smaller denominator. And it is important to take into account context to some degree. Okay, so it's useful to know the percent of a population affected by something. No doubt that can be really useful for a whole range of questions, but just use some common sense. Okay, sometimes maybe absolute numbers, just the numerators without the denominator, make more sense to use. That's all we have for this video. Whenever you decide to come back, we're going to transition from talking about forgetting to use a denominator entirely to just using the wrong one, which is at least as bad. See you soon.